Hello, Matt. Welcome back to ADHD Chatter.
Thanks for having me again. Good to see you.
I think the reason that I've brought you back is that I think it's necessary to address the Panorama episode that has caused so much pain
hmm
amongst our community. I think the ADHD community, as a result of that, is in a lot of pain, is suffering.
Yeah.
Um, what's your? Where do you think we should begin?
Wow. It's huge, really, isn't it? Let's put it like that. It's a huge topic, and I think you're right. There is a lot of pain. There's a lot of uncertainty since that program aired, um, and there seems to be a lot of people questioning all sorts of elements surrounding ADHD. So, where do you begin? I guess it would be interesting for me to start with, maybe what was the narrative they were trying to address in the documentary? Well, were there positive intentions? Um, and if there were, did they get lost in translation? Perhaps. And then I think the bigger piece is the effects. And it did have effects, or was that the intention? Was the intention that it would create debate and discourse? I mean, I guess we can't we can't know sat here, but it's certainly something I think there's a responsibility to talk about. I'm having conversations about it literally every day since. Still.
For me, I mean, yeah, absolutely. For me, it felt like a 27-minute, however long it was, ridiculously short to cover such a vast, nuanced topic that needed to really be like either a three-parter, an hour each, or a 3.5 hour full-length documentary that
Mm,
brought in people who are suffering with ADHD, lots of private clinics, lots of people from the NHS, lots of people from all angles to show how nuanced and complicated and really complicated the system was,
mm,
the situation is. To condense it into a 27, and I say the word hit piece because I think that it was, I think it was made with bad intentions. I think it was feeding into the sort of everybody has ADHD. It's a fad. It's a must-have condition narrative.
mm.
Um, ADHD UK, I had a look, have done some research and shown they asked 1,581 people with ADHD. They surveyed them, and 83% said that they think it will stop people with symptoms seeking an assessment.
Yeah.
75% of them said people with ADHD think the Panorama show will have a personal negative impact. So that's only 1,500 people. That's a lot, actually. And so the harm is tangible already.
It is, isn't it? Yeah, it really is. And I think in terms of that research alone, you look at the ADHD UK research, you look at how quickly that research has come out, right? You look at how quickly that people responded to it. It tells you how passionate they were, how hurt they were. The words I've seen day in day out are: I feel attacked, I feel hurt, I feel that my diagnosis is invalid. Um, and again, like you said, people feeling that this is just maybe I'll use the term clickbait journalism to drive this. Oh, everyone's got ADHD. It's not real. Oh, look at the next celebrity's got it. And you have to ask yourself the question: why on earth would Panorama, which when I was growing up had a reputation for being a really really good piece of journalism, and it did delve into topics in a good way. I remember them being an hour long at minimum. Why do a 27-minute hit piece that just made a mockery of so many people, so many people? And what was the intention?
No, I think it instantly stripped thousands of people of their validation. It painted the entire. I think it painted the entire private sector as dodgy.
It
It
did.
showed a few examples of dodgy clinics. Which, by the way, when there is this huge demand that is caused by other reasons, which we can talk about later, i.e.,
Yeah.
chronically funded NHS, so people are going to the private sector. Huge boom in demand. There's always going to be dodgy people trying to profiteer from that situation.
Yeah.
And they found a couple of dodgy clinics, perhaps, and they just painted the picture like it's easy to buy a diagnosis. Like if you've got a spare 750 quid, you can go and go private and get that stamp.
Yeah, I know, and it's really interesting. I had a conversation earlier today with a friend of mine who works in the prison services, teaches drama therapy, and does a lot of work with people who've sort of misused drugs. And he has ADHD as well, and we were chuckling because one of the things I've seen people saying online since is, oh, well, you see, they're giving out these highly powered stimulant meds like sweets, and anyone can get a diagnosis, and then everyone's going to get stimulant meds, and so people are now just going for a diagnosis to get the meds. And he laughed. He went, seriously, Matt, there are far easier, quicker, and cheaper ways to get stimulant meds than paying 750 quid for an ADHD diagnosis. And what addict is going to ask for a slow release stimulant in the first place? It's lunacy. But, for it to have created those kind of comments shows you what it's done. It shows you the harm that it's already done. You think, how are people making these jumps? But that's the issue, isn't it? So, yeah, I think trying to portray that all private clinics are dodgy is just irresponsible. I mean, I was diagnosed at a private clinic. I'm assuming you were. I've got friends and colleagues who were. All of us know two things. We originally went down the route of private diagnosis because potentially we either were financially able to, and we wanted to leapfrog the NHS waiting times, or we were in such a place of desperation and need that we felt we had no choice, in my case, but to expedite it. I believe my diagnosis because for 6 years prior to that, I already knew I had ADHD. It's not like I woke up on one morning and went, oh, look, a celebrity's got this ADHD thing. There's something about medication. I know I'll spend 750, in fact, in my case, way more than that, on a private diagnosis. Who would do that in the first place, right? So I don't think it's fair in any way to say all clinics are dodgy. But you're right, the way it was portrayed is that, well, if these, 2 or 3 that we're highlighting are, then they all are. Let's just tar the whole, kit and caboodle with the same brush. That's just irresponsible. It's just plain irresponsible, isn't it? And the fact is, why are people having to go that route, and why are people doing it? Because the NHS is chronically underfunded, under-resourced, because they're more stretched now than ever before. And no, that's not because TikTok's told everyone they've got ADHD, and it's not because it's trendy. It's because there's more awareness, there's more knowledge out there, and we know that since COVID, more people have done a lot of self-searching and realisation and gone, oh no, wait a minute, is that why? It's got nothing to do with it being, overprescribed or overdiagnosed, in my opinion. But that's what the documentary made it out to be. And like I say, for anyone who has had a diagnosis, even if it was with the NHS, because let's not forget, sometimes you can go through the NHS, use right to choose, and then end up through a private clinic as well, right? So let's not forget there are people who've gone the NHS route, who've waited the numbers of years and been privately assessed. Why should they sit at home now thinking, oh, do I have ADHD? And I saw a post today on TikTok, which was really interesting. I think she was a 46-year-old woman. I can't remember who it was. Just questioning it. Genuinely. That panorama has really, really thrown me. She said, I've got to put this out there because it's going around my head. They mentioned all these other conditions that it could be with no information about them. And she just asked the question, what else could this ADHD that I believe I have possibly have presented as that wasn't picked up or looked for in my assessment? Because my understanding was they looked for everything. Well, then again, that's the irresponsibility of trying to cover that in 27 minutes, isn't it?
Mm. I think
As
you
it's
hit the.
left her and other people going, oh.
I think it massively discounted the work that people do themselves in researching themselves and researching the condition before they even pick up the phone. And
Yeah,
like you said, you don't spend 750 quid minimum unless you're really at critical break point. And,
no.
so it was, I thought, very disingenuous. And it was on the backdrop of the NHS is a perfect process. If
Mm,
an NHS assessment takes 3.5 hours, lengthy
mm,
questionnaires, versus the private sector, which is a quick bit of paper and a 7-minute video call, and you'll get powerful
mm.
drugs. That was
Yeah,
the binary.
yeah,
Like, NHS is perfect and
yeah,
private sector is dodgy.
yeah,
I thought it was really
absolutely.
disingenuous to picture it.
Look, it was, and I can't remember his name now. Michael, I think his name is, the NHS clinician from South Yorkshire NHS Trust, who carried out the assessment on the documentary. Okay, look, I'm not aware of, first of all, and I'm willing to be proven wrong on this, but I'm not aware of any NHS standard diagnosis for ADHD being a 3.5 hour process. Primarily because I don't think the NHS has got time for an ADHD diagnosis to take 3.5 hours for everyone. I think that was slightly more than, shall we say, staged for the episode, staged for the documentary. And it was massively unfair that quite clearly there'd been a conversation beforehand. The clinic knew exactly what the documentary was setting out to sort of look at, so they knew what was happening, and so they gave perhaps extra time to Rory for that assessment to then come out with the no, you're categorically not, right? Fine. But by the same token, trying to say that an ADHD diagnosis through a private clinic is no more than, quote unquote, filling out some questionnaires and then a video call of between 9 and 45 minutes before I got a prescription is absolute crapola. Sorry, but it is. That's nonsense, right? If I look back at mine, for argument's sake, I had to do 2 forms before I even went into the clinic, 1 form on the day I went into the clinic, and they were each several pages long. I then waited for the clinician to sort of extrapolate all the information she wanted from those to build a picture, and then I had a 90-minute consultation privately, after which my wife and my parents were brought in for another hour. After all of that, I was given a diagnosis, and a report was sent home to me with recommendations. So that doesn't match up to what I saw on the documentary. I don't know what your experience was, but I would disagree that that's the standard. But that's what the documentary said.
Yeah, I mean, mine was very similar to yours. I had, lengthy questionnaires, which took many hours to fill in, and that was just the ones I did. My long-term partner had to fill in lengthy questionnaires. My mum had to fill in lengthy questionnaires. It took hours and hours and hours, and that was the
Mm,
basis that the psychiatrist started the hour-and-a-half video call with me. And by the way, I don't think there's a problem with being assessed virtually. Like, they made it out like that was an issue. If
yeah,
the questionnaires are filled in and the psychiatrist knows what they're talking about, which most of them do,
yeah,
it doesn't. What does it matter if they see you face to face or if it's
yeah,
they made it out
yeah.
like that was another mark against the private
I
sector,
know.
that it was just a quick virtual meeting and that was an issue.
Yeah, I know, and that's that. Well, look, that would therefore mean that this has no validity doing a podcast like this because we're not sat in the room together. That makes no sense in anyone's world. But you're right. It was a very sort of cynical way of painting it, wasn't it? Oh well, if it's over Zoom, I keep coming back to this question, right? Who's really going to take all that time and effort to not only pay but to fill in all those forms to try and gain a diagnosis of a clinical condition so that there's a chance they might get stimulant meds. Because let's not forget, the way our neurology as ADHD folk works is this: if we take stimulant meds, it slows things down for us. Right? There's a connection between dopamine and norepinephrine and serotonin and cortisol, and all of those combined means our brains slow down. Give it to somebody without ADHD, they'll look like they're in a 1990s rave somewhere in an underground car park in the suburbs of London. Why would they go through the process knowing that that's what's going to happen? But the documentary made it out, as much as the clinics are dodgy, that the patients are doing this to game it because it's trendy, because of the drugs. And you just think, oh, what on earth was that about? It just seems very callous, is the word I keep coming back to. And it's affecting people daily. It is affecting people daily.
We're hearing stories of people, as a result of the documentary, having their shared care agreements withdrawn
Yeah,
from their GP. So and that can have devastating effects on that particular person. Not to
yeah,
mention, I mean, that's a big issue in itself. Not to mention the fact that as a community, however you want to phrase it, I'll say imposter syndrome is rife. People
mm,
probably questioning their own diagnosis just because they might not feel that they're worthy of it or whatever.
oh,
We are a community with low self-esteem, and then to have
yeah,
such a reputable broadcaster like that come
yeah,
out and essentially reinforce that side of the way of thinking.
yeah,
um I mean, I'm just lost for words sometimes at how it was. I can see why it was allowed to be put out. I mean, I think, if we look, I don't know if it's the people who are going to be negatively affected are a minority, and it was very clickbaity. It was after
mm,
the general narrative, it seems to be in the press at the moment, is very anti ADHD.
yeah,
That seems to be what's sexy and what gets clicks and views and sells papers and gets eyeballs on TV screens. Um,
yeah,
and it was
yeah. I agree.
feeding into that, with little concern. It seemed to be no concern. As far as I'm aware, there were some legitimate organizations, ADHD organizations, reached out to them and said,
Yeah,
I hear you're doing this piece. Let us help. Let us make it more
yeah,
rounded and balanced. Let us
yeah,
give you our input. And as far as I can tell, it was essentially ignored because it went against the narrative. They didn't want a balanced piece that said this is good,
no,
this is bad. Real life, the truth falls somewhere in the middle.
yeah,
The editorial angle on this was clear from
yeah,
from the beginning, and it was 27
yeah.
minute
It was.
hit piece.
Yeah, and listen, I mean, from what I again have been seeing online. So if I'm reading it right, Samantha Hugh, who runs ADHD Girls, runs a Facebook forum, and one of her sort of cohort posted recently on social media to say she was devastated that she'd been tricked by an undercover journalist pretending to be someone in genuine need so that they could extrapolate information from her. I question whether there was ever a concerned parent that contacted Panorama to say, I have questions over that. Um, and I think that there's something really interesting with this. I will just say this because it's a question that's rattled around my mind since this. And I've asked some colleagues that I really sort of trust and admire for their views. If you're one of those people who watched the documentary, who now is sat there questioning the validity of your diagnosis, whether you were prescribed medication or not, if you are one of those people that feels worried, okay, the only advice that I think makes sense is you know you better than anyone else. If you went for a diagnosis because you truly believe that ADHD fitted, because all of the signs and symptoms that you've seen of ADHD fitted, and because they are still today causing you negative impact at certain times and perhaps positive at others. Okay, if you really question that diagnosis but you're still struggling, I don't know, maybe reach out to a credible ADHD coach. Reach out to a credible network of ADHD support and try and get some support and feedback from that. Don't sit there now asking yourself, oh, was it right though? Have I really got ADHD? Because the answer is, I'm going to stick my neck on the line 99.999% of the time. Yes, you did have, you do have, and you will have. Don't let a piece of 27-minute clickbait journalism make you question you. But isn't it appalling that it has?
Gosh, yeah. I mean, that was a yeah. I mean, you articulated really, I think, the feelings of the community perfectly there. Especially, in a. I think what it's also done is that it's made the channel of communication harder, cross generational. A lot of people my age and younger and your age, we're fully on board with ADHD. There's a lot of potentially people in the older generation, parents, grandparents, who aren't quite convinced yet, and their children or their are coming forward and saying, mum, dad, whatever, I've got ADHD, and they might be on the fence, and they might say, oh, what are you talking about? And if they're on the fence, this documentary, if they watched it, might have just tipped them over onto the, oh, you're talking rubbish side, which is going to be so damaging for that younger child or friend.
It is, and I think here's again one of the words I've been hearing a lot, which really frustrates me, is people have been those conversations where people are saying, "Oh, so suddenly you've got ADHD." No, I've always had ADHD. I may not have presented until there was a life-changing event, until there was, I don't know, whether it's trauma, sadness, whatever. I may not have struggled, but I've always had it. It's predominantly a genetically inherited condition. Trauma plays into it. We understand that. But come on. I didn't wake up and suddenly have ADHD. I woke up and couldn't carry the weight of struggling, not knowing why I was different, not knowing why I found life so hard, maybe jumping from job to job, not maintaining friendships. All of these things we know that people seeking diagnosis tend to struggle with. Okay? That's why suddenly the need to spend money or to ask for an assessment. You don't just wake up and jump on a bandwagon for fun. But that's the question people are being asked. Suddenly you've got ADHD. It makes no sense, does it? In no other world does that make sense. But there you go, that's the question. My responsibility doing what I do, and yours with a platform like this, I believe, is to help people feel that if anyone knows them better than anyone else, it's themselves. Trust your intuition on this one.
Absolutely. There was an opportunity to really put a responsible message out with the airtime that documentary took up. It could have highlighted there are millions of people in the UK who are suffering from a mental health condition, whether that's ADHD or autism or depression, anxiety. Those millions of people need help, but they can't get it through wait times, etc. So they're having to go to the private sector. On top of that, the ADHD community in particular also suffers from a very negative, a stigma that it's not a serious condition. Like, you wouldn't say to someone, oh, don't be silly, your depression's not real, or your anxiety isn't real. Maybe a few people, but I think ADHD gets a much harder time than that.
It does.
And to say that to sort of paint the picture that it's too easy to get a diagnosis, just that kind of language really sort of displays your prejudice. If you think that a serious condition is too easy to get, that implies that it's just feeding into that. It's a must have. It's a cool thing to, celebrities are, it's a must have thing. Such a wasted opportunity.
It was, wasn't it? Yeah, it really was a wasted opportunity. And, I know we'll probably talk about this later, but that's why so many people have complained. So many people have registered a formal complaint to the BBC from within the community to say, no, I'm not accepting that. That wasn't right. It'd be interesting to see what the Ofcom results of all of that are at some point. But that's why so many people, and I would urge anyone that's been affected by it to do that. Complain. You have to air your voice, your grievance. You have to say, no, I don't stand for this. And that's whether you're an adult with ADHD, whether you're the parent of a kid with ADHD. Heck, even if you're a teacher or an educator of pupils and they struggle, please just, please complain, because they shouldn't be allowed to have got away with that scot-free.
Absolutely. And as far as I'm aware, I don't think, just taking a step back a second, the message that powerful drugs are being handed out too easily, essentially. And okay, was the titration period mentioned at all in the documentary? I don't think it really was. And that's
No.
a process that stops powerful drugs being handed out really easily.
Yeah.
So as far as I haven't been through that, so I don't know. But as far as I'm aware,
No, it is. Yeah, no, you're right. Absolutely. So I can only speak from my experience, and this is the preface again, not a doctor, not a clinician, not medically trained, but experienced enough, having been through this with myself, my two sons, and other people I've advocated for and supported for. So I know the process, and actually having spoke to my own psychiatrist at length. So you're right, titration. This period of, okay, we think you may have ADHD, we think medication may help. Now, typically, and what the documentary was trying to lead people to believe was, typically you'll get a powerful stimulant med prescribed at working dose that you take from day one. Doesn't happen. Okay, it doesn't matter. There are two standard or three standard compounds of stimulant med in the UK: methylphenidate, lisdexamfetamine, and dexamphetamine. Right, and they work in slightly different ways, but they all achieve a similar effect. So they're this slowing our minds down. To be prescribed like any drug, and by the way, saying it's powerful is a real hyperbolic statement. So is paracetamol. Have you ever read the label on a box of paracetamol for what could happen if? It's no different, right? So let's get that out there. But before you can be prescribed stimulant meds, you have to typically provide at least a week's worth of blood pressure and heart rate monitorings, as well as your pulse. You have to have your weight and your height monitored. Okay, they're looking for heart health, they're looking for heart stressors, they're looking for any reason that a stimulant would not be the right medication for you before they'll even consider prescribing it. Not at the end of a 45-minute call, there you go pick it up tomorrow from Boots. Sorry, doesn't happen. Titration periods vary, anywhere from first dose to working dose. I've heard of between 6 weeks to 3 months, dependent on how that person responds individually to the medication. And then in the first year, typically, it should be reviewed at least twice. At least twice. Okay? Now, that's not, I had a Zoom call, I chucked a load of medication down my neck and it was powerful and caused me harm. And by the way, I think they used the magic word addictive. It's only addictive if you don't have ADHD, and you would be likely to be addicted to any kind of stimulant, be that medical grade designed for ADHD or off the street illegal drugs. Okay, if you have ADHD, you are not going to become addicted, in my understanding, to stimulant meds. So that's part one of this. That was nonsense. It did, however, and I will say this, it did expose what I believe personally is a question that I have in all of the diagnosis and assessment criteria, whether it's NHS or private, which is not enough people are told there are other options outside of stimulant medication. Not enough people have the information that says, if stimulants don't suit you, by the way, there are some non-stimulant options that can work as effectively. Right? How do I know? I did my research, I take them. Right? My ADHD is controlled by an anti-anxiety med. Now, if we were given that information properly, it would give patients more ability to make a choice. It's not to say the stimulants are dangerous, it's to say, like any medication, they might not suit people. But for some reason we're not. And then we have to agree, okay, that there are those people, Case in point, you, for who they don't want to take meds, they don't feel that's necessary. So you can go down the route of, like I've mentioned before, coaching. You could go down the route of getting an ADHD mentor, right? There are lots of other non-medicinal ways you run, like we said on the first podcast, to clear your mind. Exercise, socializing, anything that releases healthy dopamine works for you, as long as you're balancing it with your sort of norepinephrine, right? Fine. But there are lots of ways that we can manage our ADHD. Stimulants are just one. It's just fascinating that that documentary only mentioned them, isn't it?
Mm.
It's fascinating that they made them out to be this demon drug and everyone that takes them is going to end up addicted. I have yet to meet anyone addicted to their stimulant medication who's got ADHD.
My private clinic did mention medication after my diagnosis. Not verbally, they gave me a report, and it had about 7 pages of what I could do next if I wanted to take steps to make my life a bit easier if I was struggling to such an extent.
Yeah,
Medication was on page 2. They never pushed it. Page 1 was a list of loads of online resources, and actually just a list of simple things, which is what I do now and what I've
yeah,
subconsciously already done. What you mentioned: exercise, diet,
yeah,
breath work, cold showers, all this kind of stuff.
yeah,
It wasn't pushed. I mean, however, I will say it did only mention stimulant medication on the
yeah,
medication section, which is an
yeah.
issue that you do think is something that does deserve attention.
Yeah, I do, and I think it's a conversation that I think needs to be had. Um, I can't speculate on the reasons that we only get told about stimulant meds. I know they're more expensive as a medication than the anti-anxiety med that I take, and so okay, there could be a financial implication there, but I don't know. That's purely speculation. Um, but like I say, it would have been nice to know that was an option. It would have been good to know that from the start, because here's the thing: I'm learning more and more that there are lots of people who come to ADHD through lifelong struggles with anxiety or depression, or worse, feelings of suicidal ideation, right? Because life has been that hard. Now, in that case, my understanding is that dopamine based meds aren't actually going to address any underlying anxiety issues. They aren't actually going to balance the entire system. They will potentially rebalance your dopamine. That's only a part of it, right? I keep coming back to norepinephrine or noradrenaline. Go away, Google it, look it up, right? This is a thing, and it's the balance between the two, is my understanding, that particularly if you're anxious, particularly if you struggle, that's what we need. And without that, again, what I'm beginning to understand is that can then lead to problems caused by our ADHD symptoms, like addiction. Because let's be honest, what's addiction? It's a way to get relief from anxiety for a lot of people. It's to take us out of the stress. Your dopamine medication isn't going to do that. Now, wouldn't it be a right thing to do generically for people to be given that information, that assessment?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Yeah, it would be because these, as far as I'm aware, these stimulant meds, even if you take them in low dose, over a long period of time, nothing like this is without a cost, right? I mean, if there's an alternative to essentially, micro dosing,
Mm.
stimulants, then I'm thinking that was really my concern with them. Was I think I can manage my ADHD in unmedicated ways,
Yeah.
and that's not to say that I don't have bad days. I have them all the time,
No.
and I sometimes am tempted for medication because there are serious struggles that I don't, that running doesn't help with.
Yeah, yeah, sure.
But I mean, just going back to the documentary, like you said, I think it has highlighted an issue with how options are presented after diagnosis.
Mm.
And do you think that so you think that they should present a much wider spectrum of options after a diagnosis?
Whether it's after diagnosis, whether it's on the websites of clinics, and just general information, I don't know. Why isn't there a page on a website that says, okay, this is, potentially treatment for ADHD could involve X, Y, Z, A, B, C. This is the detail. Go away, research it. I can't see why that's not done more frequently, because, knowledge is power is the old adage, isn't it? And the other thing to this, right? So the medication thing has got another side to this, which I think again the documentary missed, or it touched on. Actually, it didn't miss. So dependent on the clinic you go to, and also dependent on your local NHS area, there is no guarantee that if you're diagnosed and then prescribed by a private psychiatrist stimulant medication, there's no guarantee that your doctor, your GP, will accept what's known as a shared care agreement. Now, typically, in the past, before this documentary, shared care agreements were refused because stimulant meds are so expensive. Right? My average monthly prescription from titration to working dose, and for the nigh on 18 months after of taking them rather, was £90 a month. Okay, that is an incredible sum of money for drugs. I was lucky. My GP accepted shared care, which meant thereafter my prescription cost me, well, what is it, £9.95 now, right? If you are not lucky enough to get a shared care agreement, we've now got a situation where there might be people who funded their private diagnosis by, scrimping and saving or borrowing, even worse, on credit cards or short-term loans or whatever it may be, out of desperation. How are they going to afford a £90 a month prescription long term? If they're told this is for life, how on earth are they supposed to do that if shared care doesn't get agreed? And yet, if on that page on the website it was, yes, stimulant meds, but there's an alternative as well, SNRI, and if they knew that, it might have just been a £9.95 prescription from day one. Why aren't we given that information, that choice? I don't understand that bit. I at the risk of sounding a bit tinfoil hat, Alex, right? I don't know why we're not given that information. Why is that withheld, typically? Because it doesn't seem to stack up to me. But there you go, that's the way it is. So what happens? You either are lucky enough to get shared care, or you've got to fund it yourself. Ouch, is all I can say.
Mm.
I'm thankful I don't have to anymore.
I started the process of going on the titration and going down the medication route a few months ago, and I went to my GP and I told him which clinic I got assessed by, and he looked them up, and he was very satisfied that they were credible, and the psychiatrist who assessed me personally, in fact, he knew, funnily enough, and she does dual work for the NHS and private clinics in the evenings. And my assessment was in the evening with her. And I think that's, again, part of the problem with the documentary is that it lacked that balance. The narrative was like NHS good, private bad, when in actual fact, a lot of the psychiatrists who are doing the work for both.
Yeah, of course they do. Yeah, absolutely they do. And you're right, the balance to show that, to even just to say that and admit that, was lacking, because now, every private psychiatrist is just a snake oil salesman, and they're unscrupulous, and they're just, please, they're not. I mean, like you say, that's just madness to even try and push that as a narrative, but push that narrative it did. And go back to what you said about maybe people who've got parents or friends or whoever else who are looking at that as credible information about the process of thinking I've got ADHD to an assessment and a diagnosis. Now they just think, oh well, no, and I go back to this thing of desperation. Okay, I go back to this point of desperation. If you're at breaking point because life has been so damned hard, and if you think I have got to figure this out, that's where I was, right? I had come off the back of a complete, total and utter physical and mental breakdown in November of 2019. I was in the grip of suicidal ideation. I could see literally no point in carrying on because I had struggled for so long with life. And I sobbed to my parents on the phone and said, I've got to know. And I'll be honest, at that point, I only knew stimulant meds, right? I only knew meds meant stimulants, and I sobbed and said, I have to know if this can help. I cannot wait, at that point, the 4 years I was told it might take me to get a diagnosis. And I actually said to them, if I have to wait 4 years, I won't be here in 4 years. So they funded my diagnosis. They researched with me. We went to a clinic that I trusted. Okay. And I got that assessment and I got that medication. And I will be forever grateful that what that did was set me on a path of learning to bring me to where I am today. I have no ill will to my clinic and I trust them implicitly. I would recommend them in a heartbeat. But the documentary would not have painted it like that, would it? And if you've got somebody now going as a parent to a young adult, I saw that documentary, oh no, they're all dodgy, darling, no, we can't do that, you're just going to have to wait. I'm sorry, we are putting really vulnerable people in really vulnerable positions at huge risk.
Yeah.
Well done, Panorama.
Yeah. No, it's awful. People know themselves best, right? Even though it doesn't necessarily help, you've got ADHD before a professional tells you you've got ADHD. That's why especially if you're going in the private route, that's why you're desperate and you're spending 750 quid. You're at that point, critical point. That's why diagnosis rates are so high in the private sector, because you don't spend that amount of money unless you desperately need the confirmation to get on medication or to get other support that you can't get without the bit of paper. There are going to be a few dodgy clinics, and they found them. They found them. But to not say that was just the tip of the iceberg, and as I said earlier, it should have been a much longer documentary. They should have approached 20 private clinics and showed that it was, less than 1% probably that are profiteering in an unethical and irresponsible way. But it didn't do that. It painted the picture that all the private clinics are profiteering against the perfect NHS, which, by the way, like you said earlier, an NHS assessment is not 3.5 hours. I'm sure if you're very, very, very lucky, it might be, but I imagine it's actually very similar to what I experienced in my private assessment. And let's not pretend that the NHS doesn't, and I'm not bashing the NHS. I love the NHS. The NHS literally saved my life a few years ago for other reasons. But they quite easily hand out powerful, like you said, I got put on citalopram when I was 16 years old after a 10-minute meeting with my GP. And I look back and I think that was probably quite irresponsible.
Absolutely.
After a 10-minute meeting with my GP, I got put on very powerful antidepressants, which put me in a really nasty place, so no one's perfect. The NHS can sometimes be irresponsible. The private sector can sometimes be irresponsible, but most of the time they're both really good.
Yeah. And let's be realistic, right? Again, and I echo what you say, NHS or private, let's be realistic. The only information any clinician has to go on, when they make that assessment is the pre-diagnostic forms that they have been asked to fill in and how that person presents on the day in front of them, whether it's on a camera or face to face. Okay, I went into my diagnosis broken. It was fairly obvious I was broken. I told my psychiatrist I was broken. Quite similarly, you could have someone going in feeling perfectly fine, going, no, I'm quite happy. Yeah, I just think I've struggled, right? That clinician still has to make a professional judgment based on a set of criteria. Now, there is a completely separate conversation to be had here about does the DSM-5 criteria actually do a good job and a full and rounded job of assessing people for ADHD. That's a different discussion, right? It's one I've had several times with sort of friends who are psychologists, and there's conjecture. Doesn't matter. That's what we've got at the moment. You have to meet a certain amount of those criteria, and they have to have been present for a minimum of 6 months, and they have to have significant daily recurring impact. Right? No one who goes in going, oh, I'm a bit forgetful, I lose my keys every now and again, is going to come out with an ADHD diagnosis. They're going to come out with a piece of elastic attached to their belt so they don't lose the keys. Right? That's the problem. Right? The clinicians are only as good as the patient presents on the day. The diagnostic system's only as good as it is, and that's the tool they've got to work with. We can't bash either of them. But yes, you're right. Just as there are maybe unscrupulous clinics in the private sector, there may be doctors and clinicians having a bad day in the NHS. Right? You can't take the human out of this process on either side of the table. But that still doesn't invalidate anybody's diagnosis. It can't. You can't let a 27-minute documentary invalidate your diagnosis. You just can't.
Like you said, like the assessment process for this is subjective, right? It's not. There's no blood test for it. You can't take as far as I'm aware, correct me if I'm wrong, you can't take a brain scan for it or anything like that.
Well, no, we can't. But yeah, there are brain scans that do show ADHD.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, no, that you can categorically see what's different in an ADHD brain and prefrontal cortex and hippocampus and where dopamine is and isn't firing. So no, we can see it. Absolutely we can. Blood test, no. But that withstanding, like you've said, people know what they struggle with. And if they've sat at home and done all the online tests and everyone's gone off the charts, it's a pretty damn good starting point to say, I think I might need to look at this a bit further, isn't it? It's unlikely. And that was the other bit, I think, that I found really galling. The I don't know whether I call it script or I'll call it the script for want of a better description. The scripting of some of this was frustrating. To say, about all the clinics, oh, well, yeah, 90% of people that come through the door walk out with a diagnosis. I would sort of expect that, right? If they'd said 10% of people come out with a diagnosis, I would have thought something was much worse and there was something very wrong with the process. Because again, people are not wasting their time and putting themselves through the trauma of saying, I think I have this, for fun. But to use that as a headline piece, to use that as oh, that's terrible, oh, really, that many people coming out with a diagnosis? I'm sure it's probably 90% of people that walk out of a doctor's surgery every day with a prescription as well. Does that mean that's inaccurate and wrong? But it was just the spin, wasn't it? It was just the spin to make everything seem wrong about this.
Yeah, like you said, it's people who know themselves. They know that they've struggled and their whole life, but they don't know why. Or maybe they've seen something online or they've spoken to someone and now they know why. They know that it's ADHD, but they need that diagnosis. They want that validation.
Yeah.
They want that confirmation, so they spend the money. It's so clear that that's why the rate of diagnosis is so high in the private sector.
It is. It is. And by the way, there were lots of numbers thrown around on the documentary about how many people have got ADHD in the UK. Can we just remember that there are hundreds of thousands of people, quite likely, who are sat on NHS waiting lists who cannot afford to go private. There are people who may never even put themselves on an NHS waiting list, who are undiagnosed clinically but are self-diagnosing as I struggle with ADHD, who are likely to get no clinical support. Okay? They are not, again, doing that to jump on a trend. They're doing that because they're struggling and they've got information from somewhere that says, oh, wait a minute, might I be able to get some support, even if I can't afford or if the wait times are too long for a clinical diagnosis.
And
Now,
just the,
that's
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, just the process as well of seeking an assessment, whether you go private or you go down the NHS, that process in itself for someone with ADHD is quite daunting and overwhelming.
yeah,
So there's probably a load of
yeah,
other people as well who just haven't, for whatever reason, have been unable to pluck
yeah,
up the courage or whatever the thoughts, the
yeah.
organisation to take that step. So that's a whole nother pool of people that haven't even joined that
Completely
waiting
is.
list.
Completely is. I literally every week am still contacted by people on various platforms saying, I think I might have, but I'm unsure. What should I do? And the question is, okay, if you think you have, how is it impacting your daily life? Is it severely negatively impacting you frequently enough that it's causing you problems? Because if it is, personally, I'd go seek some clinical advice on this. If it's just every now and again I find something a bit difficult, maybe you can manage this on your own and use a framework of ADHD, right? But again, you can't discount that. It is daunting, particularly I think for people who've reached a certain point in life, people who've maybe, managed to hold down jobs, relationships, have kids, etc., to then have to admit, oh, wait a minute, that's why. That's why I've not excelled as much, had the promotions, had the successes that I've seen other people have. Maybe that's why relationships have broken down. To actually have to be strong enough to admit there could be a reason for that. And not only to admit there might be a reason, but that you might need to actually ask for some help. It takes an awful lot of pride and humility to do that. I keep going back to this. Nobody's doing this because it's fun. Or if they are, I think there's other problems. Right? They've got other issues if they think this is a laugh. But
Mm.
that's how the documentary made me feel. Oh, anyone can do it. Anyone can jump on a Zoom call and Connor, clinically trained, by the way, professional, into giving them an ADHD diagnosis and walk away with a box of pills. Behave.
Mm. I mean,
Just behave.
I don't doubt that it's possible for, if you really wanted to get a diagnosis, if you didn't have
Yeah,
ADHD and if you knew enough about it, I could walk into Specsavers and misread the thing on the wall and they would
of course
give
you could.
me expensive, thick glasses.
Yeah, yeah.
Again, it's a subjective test. But yeah, why would someone do that? It doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't. And again, this is the question I'd love to sit down in front of the team that put it together. Right? I would love to sit down and just ask them, what were you thinking? You know? How big a bender was the night before when somebody sat in the office and went, I've got a great idea. Because they must have been absolutely trolleyed to think it was credible journalism.
Mm.
I can't imagine for a minute they were sober. But there you go. That's just my opinion. It just doesn't fit with my understanding of this. It just doesn't. But there is another element to this. Just jumped into my head. Somebody mentioned to me that one of the things on the documentary they were confused by was the range of people carrying out the assessments. So there were nurse practitioners, there were psychiatrists, there were nurses, there were various other people who were doing the assessments. Now, need to do some research into this, but my understanding is it is possible to pay a qualified clinical psychiatrist and psychologist to do a course as long as you have the right medical background that says you're able to diagnose and assess. But it's also possible that people can receive training to carry out an assessment. Now, there's a risk in that, I will admit. There is a risk that there are people carrying out assessments who may be under pressure that aren't, shall I say, as qualified as they should be. But again, it doesn't matter, because before the diagnosis is formalised, it has to be presented to a clinical psychiatrist, is my understanding. They are formally trained and they look at all of the reports that other person puts together, and they are the one that says yes or no. So even if there was a question over the ability of the person that's on the Zoom call, they are not the one typically making the final decision. So again, does it invalidate anyone's experience? No. If it was validated by a trained CQC registered professional, there's your validity.
I'm really conscious to keep this episode sort of around about the
shorter
hour
than
mark.
The last one.
Yeah. I think we
I'll get a reputation here, won't I? Sorry.
Is there anything, I mean, we're coming up to an hour now. I think we could probably go for 5 or 10 more minutes. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you think we should include?
I'm just running this in my head. No, I think we would both agree with anyone that saw it that, please don't take this as gospel. Please don't look at that documentary as being a really accurate representation of how ADHD is assessed, diagnosed, and whether it is valid. That's one. Yes, have some critical thinking if you are going to seek a diagnosis. Have some critical thinking, do your research any number of clinics you want, pick one that you're happy with. Yeah. No stimulant meds aren't dangerous. They're just not if you have ADHD and they've been prescribed with a titration period and you're getting regular reviews. So don't be afraid of medication. That's not a dirty word, but be aware there are alternatives that you might need to ask for or you might need to research yourself. Be aware also, case in point, that you can, or certain people can, manage ADHD without needing medical intervention using other things, the coaching, the help, mental health strategies, mindfulness, and that's as valid as medication if it works for you. And be aware that might change. You might get to a point in life where you think, no, I do need medication now. And that is absolutely okay as well. So that's fine. But I think the biggest takeaway for me should be, if this documentary had the same impact it had on me and you and many other people, which was it really, really angered you and frustrated you, and you felt attacked as somebody with ADHD, please register your complaint. Because the only way we prevent nonsense like this on TV again is by making sure that those commissioning this kind of stuff know that they shouldn't. That's my takeaways from it, I think.
You've taken the words out of my mouth. That was going to be my closing call to action, but you've said it perfectly. Complain. If we can get some kind of headline, I know a lot of people are calling for the complaints to go in. Many have gone in, and hopefully after this, a few more can go in. If there can be a headline that says 20,000 people have complained to the BBC for the episode, then that's impactful. That's super impact. That's powerful, and that actually takes away credibility of the documentary, if it has any. You know, there are a lot of people who it will have credibility to, which is a shame, but it will chip away at that if there's another headline that says 20,000 people have complained against it. So if there's one thing that you can do, I've already done it. Complain, absolutely.
100%. And I will just say this to Ed. I really hope that one day there is a piece of journalism, a TV documentary, like you said, whether it's multiple episodes, 3 hours long, I really don't care. I really, really hope in the not too distant future, something actually gets commissioned by someone with a conscience that's researched, that's beneficial, and that is actually there to give people with ADHD of any age in life, kids through to pensioners, a sense that this is a real condition that comes with real struggles, that comes with real challenges, but that can be really treatable and helped as well. That's what we need. After this, we need the anti-documentary, right? The antithesis to this one. And, you know, I really hope that happens. And if it doesn't, I'm going to start making one on YouTube, because I'm getting so frustrated by the rhetoric that I'm seeing on other platforms as well, bashing ADHD at the moment, that it's just, it needs to happen.
Definitely. And yeah, so well said. And if anyone's listening that has, I know there will be people listening who have been really injured by the documentary. Be aware that it was made with, it had an editorial agenda. It was very biased. It was very one-sided. It was not on our side. With that awareness, you can hopefully take away some of the impact that it's done over time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, I know that you've got the link to the complaint form. I think one of the main ones that's been used. So yeah, absolutely. I will just again say what you said. Thank you for letting me come on again. Thank you for asking me to come on and talk about this. I really appreciate you giving me another chance to talk about this. And you know, if you and I are able to add our voices to all the others who've done similar things, please go away and complain. That's all we can do, isn't it? Tell them they were wrong by showing them.
Spot on. Thank you so much, Matt. And I'm sure we will make this a hat trick on your podcast guest appearance at some point.
You never know. You never know. Listen, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Brilliant. Cheers, Matt. Bye.
Bye now.